On the 17th of September 1944, the British 1st Airborne Division landed near the town of Arnhem. Their objective was the road bridge over the River Rhine, the last natural barrier between the Western Allies and Germany. They were supposed to capture the bridge and hold it for 2 days until relief arrived. Instead, 10 days later, the battered remnants of the division were finally withdrawn from the battle. Of the 10,000 men that dropped in, only 2,000 made it back. So, what happened? Why did the attack on Arnhem go so disastrously wrong? Well, to answer that question, we've teamed up with Airborne Assault, the Regimental Museum of the Parachute Regiment and Airborne Forces. Using their objects, we'll tell the story of a battle where everything that could go wrong did go wrong, and yet one which came surprisingly close to succeeding. This is the story of the Battle of Arnhem. By September 1944, the Allies were running rampant. They had smashed German forces at Falaise and raced to the West Wall, the final defensive line that guarded the way into Germany. To cross it, they came up with a daring plan using airborne forces. The leading British unit was the 1st Airborne Division.
So this is one of the wonderful uniforms we have on display at the Airborne Assault Museum. It belonged to Sergeant Denning. He was a driver in the Royal Engineers as part of the 1st Airborne Division. He's got his face veil here, which he's using as a scarf to help you camouflage. Talking of camouflage, he's got the iconic Denison smock. This was the first camouflaged uniform issued to the British Army. He's also got his maroon beret, which signifies he's a member of the Airborne Forces, and of course proudly wearing his Royal Engineers cap badge there. And he went on to become an extra in the famous film A Bridge Too Far, and he actually wore his original smock in that film.
These were elite troops with experience in North Africa, Sicily and Italy, but their deployment in Northern Europe was long awaited. 15 previous airborne operations had been devised and then cancelled as Allied advances overran the areas the airborne forces were supposed to capture. The plan that eventually went forward was called Operation Market Garden. In Operation Market, 3 airborne divisions under Frederick Boy Browning would land in the German-occupied Netherlands, capturing the bridges over important rivers in the area. Meanwhile, Operation Garden would see British 30 Corps under Brian Horrocks drive up Highway 69 to relieve them. The operation was supposed to take 2 days, 4 at most.
You will notice in our displays briefing maps that we used for Operation Overlord, Operation Varsity, and of course the earlier operation in Bruneval. But we have no planning maps for Operation Market Garden. It's because they weren't created. In fact, the order given to the commanders was only given on the 12th of September 1944. The operation started on the 17th. This hasty planning would have consequences in the overall operation.
There were many problems with the Market Garden plan. Due to fears over anti-aircraft fire over Arnhem itself, the men of the 1st Airborne were to be dropped 8 to 10 miles away from their objective. Not only that, but a lack of transport aircraft also meant that the division would have to be delivered over multiple days. 1st Airborne Commander Roy Urquhart protested, but he got nowhere. On day 1, 1st Air Landing Brigade would guard the drop zones, while 1st Parachute Brigade captured the road and rail bridges in Arnhem. On day 2, when 4th Parachute Brigade arrived along with the remainder of the air landing units, they would reinforce the troops at the bridges. By the time the Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade arrived on day 3, the division would hold a large defensive perimeter around the town.
So here we have the actual map used by General Boy Browning in Operation Market Garden. It's incredibly delicate, so we cannot unfold it fully. But if you look at the detailing closely, you can see he has hastily scribbled in pencil lots of notes and numbers. And I think this gives you the indication of the stress that he was under to make decisions quickly and under immense pressure. Airborne troops have the element of surprise, and this is probably the biggest weapon in their arsenal. But the advantage only works if they're used correctly. One of the big problems with Operation Market Garden was landing the 1st Airborne Division so far away from their main objective, the bridge at Arnhem. These landing zones and drop zones had to be reused over several days, which diluted the force, which could have been used potentially to push forward to their main objective, the town of Arnhem.
Despite the issues, the attack went ahead. Many Allied commanders believed that the German army in the west was a spent force. The presence of 2 SS Panzer divisions in the Arnhem area was dismissed as they were both well below half strength. Above all, what propelled Operation Market Garden forward was an eagerness to get into battle. The risks seemed worth taking for a chance to end the war. The reality of the operation would turn out to be very different. On the 17th of September, Operation Market Garden began. The huge armada of over 1,500 aircraft and nearly 500 gliders made it the largest airborne operation in history to that point. Both the British and American drops went to plan. First to land were British Pathfinders, who guided in the rest of 1st Airborne, first the gliders and then the paratroopers. It was a brilliant start, but in those vital first hours what mattered most were the bridges. With his infantry landing so far from their objective, Urquhart tasked the 1st Airborne Reconnaissance Squadron with a coup de main, aiming to swiftly seize the road bridge by surprise.
Unfortunately, they took around 2 hours to assemble on the landing zone. This gave the Germans vital time to set up stop lines on the approach roads to the town in Arnhem. 3 routes were designated, but on the day it was decided that the majority of men and jeeps would rush along one route only. The jeeps that they were driving were fast, light and agile, but they were only lightly armed and they had no armour at all. Ultimately, this led to their downfall. These unarmoured vehicles were quickly overcome by machine gun fire and mortar fire, and these elite troops suddenly found themselves becoming defensive troops, a task they were not designed or trained for.
The German response was lightning fast. They cobbled together ad hoc formations known as Kampfgruppen, which worked to delay the British. Kampfgruppe Kraft, which had stopped the Recce squadron, was soon joined by Kampfgruppe Spindler, which was setting up another blocking line just outside of Arnhem. With every passing hour, the Germans grew stronger. The British had to act, and fast. Leaving the air landing forces to guard the drop zones, the 3 battalions of 1st Parachute Brigade moved out towards the bridges. 1st Battalion tried to outflank Kampfgruppe Kraft but ran up against Kampfgruppe Weber. Meanwhile, 3rd Battalion became embroiled in a firefight with Kampfgruppe Kraft and then Kampfgruppe Spindler. Only 2nd Battalion under John Frost made any progress. They skirted south and managed to make it all the way to the rail bridge, but as they moved to cross it, the bridge was destroyed by German sappers. Still, they continued moving, and by 8 o'clock they had reached Arnhem Road Bridge. Though a pillbox on the far side stopped them from crossing, Frost's force of around 800 men was able to dig in on the north side and wait for relief.
Another object we have on display is the uniform of the then Lieutenant Colonel Frost. He was a very experienced airborne soldier. Frost was on the very first parachute raid in February 1942 on Operation Biting. He also fought with distinction across North Africa. He knew that speed and aggression was essential to taking the objective. And I think a lot of this was down to his experience of airborne fighting, getting to the bridge and hanging on for as long as possible, far past what was ever expected of him.
As day 1 drew to a close, there were big problems elsewhere. The 101st had taken one bridge at Wechel, but 2 others had been destroyed. The 82nd had taken Grave, but failed to capture the main bridge at Nijmegen. And meanwhile, 30 Corps had advanced just 7 miles up the highway. Market Garden was off to a poor start, but the worst was yet to come. In the early morning of day 2, the reconnaissance battalion from 9th SS Panzer Division attempted to recapture the Arnhem Road Bridge, but as they crossed from the south, they came under withering fire from Frost's men. Scores of vehicles were destroyed and the commander himself was killed. But while the British had held their ground, they expended a lot of ammunition in the firefight. Frost soon instructed his men to stop sniping at the enemy to conserve their meagre supply. Meanwhile, the rest of 1st Parachute Brigade resumed their attacks towards the bridge, but in the urban terrain, progress was painfully slow. Urquhart himself had joined the 3rd Battalion the previous day in an attempt to hurry them along, but now, as he made his way back to his HQ, he ended up trapped in a house on the outskirts of Arnhem. It only added to the British communication problems.
Some of the smaller radios would only have a range of maybe 2 miles if you were lucky. Some of the larger radios on Jeeps would have had a range of maybe 8 miles. The landing and drop zones were 8 to 10 miles away from their objective. This led to lots of communication problems. On display here, we actually have one of these large heavy radios. I think just looking at it, you can see how cumbersome this device is. And at that time, they were using lead acid batteries, a bit like you get on your car. They have a very short lifespan. Can you imagine running out under fire and dragging this incredibly heavy container with its equipment to a safe location, then unpacking it, plugging it all together, and then finding it doesn't work?
With Urquhart missing, Philip Hicks took charge. He ordered reinforcements to join 1st Parachute Brigade as soon as they landed, but they were delayed by poor weather in England and couldn't link up in time. Their all-out attack would have to wait until the following day, a day that would become known as Black Tuesday. As day 3 dawned, Frost's men were being squeezed from all sides. It was now or never for the rest of 1st Parachute Brigade. The initial attack went well, managing to free the house in which Urquhart was trapped. However, they soon became enveloped by German fire from all sides, including the remnants of the reconnaissance battalion on the other side of the river. Casualties began to mount. By now, the British forces were increasingly exhausted, and they had few heavy weapons with which to challenge the Stugs and flak guns of the German defenders.
So this is a 1943 Bren gun Mark I, and this is their main offensive weapon on Operation Market Garden. This was a very popular weapon. It's very easy to use, it's very accurate, and being airborne troops, they tended to carry a lot more automatic weapons per platoon than most regular troops. The downside to carrying automatic weapons, of course, they need to be supplied with ammunition. This weapon system is capable of firing maybe 550 rounds a minute. The magazine can hold maybe 30 rounds. You've got to carry all that ammunition. You can fire it, but you've got to get resupplied. If you don't get the ammunition, the men can't use the weapon system. And if they can't use the weapon system, they're liable to be captured and lose the battle.
As British ammunition began to run out, particularly for the Piat anti-tank weapons, the German forces counterattacked. The British were almost overrun and were forced to withdraw, but in the chaos of the battle, no more than 500 men returned. 1st Parachute Brigade effectively ceased to exist, and any chance of reaching Frost was gone. Now, things went from bad to worse. Poor weather that morning thwarted attempts to land the Polish forces and grounded Allied air support. Improved weather in the afternoon allowed resupply flights to come in, but not only were the aircraft savaged by German flak, the pre-arranged drop zones had been overrun by the Germans.
The troops the British were facing had just finished anti-airborne training. The Germans knew these lightly equipped troops were reliant on supply by air. If they could capture the zones where these supplies were coming into, they knew they would have a massive advantage. Men on the ground of the 1st Airborne Division desperately tried to signal the pilots, but of course they were trained to ignore any signals from the ground in case they were being given misinformation. As a consequence, all the men of the 1st Airborne Division were running on empty.
By the end of day 3, 30 Corps had managed to link up with the 82nd at Nijmegen, but the all-important bridge was still in German hands. While Frost's men held onto the bridge at Arnhem, neither side could reinforce their bridge. The question was, which bridge would fall first? By day 4, Frost's perimeter was shrinking. German tanks and guns were blasting them out of their positions one by one. A short truce allowed the British to evacuate their wounded, which now included Frost himself. They could not hold out much longer. Knowing he couldn't reach the bridge, Urquhart pulled the remainder of his force into a defensive perimeter near the town of Oosterbeek. He now planned to hold on to the crossing point at Heveadorp, where it was believed a Bailey Bridge could be built by Allied engineers. The Polish forces, now due to land on day 5, had their drop zone moved to Driel to assist in this. However, Camp Group Spindler and von Tettau continued to squeeze the British lodgement. In hectic woodland fighting, there were heavy losses on both sides, and by the end of the day, the British had been forced into a thumb-shaped line centred on their HQ at the Hartenstein Hotel. The Germans soon nicknamed the perimeter the Witch's Cauldron.
On display, we have a howitzer that was actually used to defend Hartenstein. But the problem was, they didn't have the ammunition to feed this weapon. Big field guns like this are very hard to manoeuvre, and they're very easy targets for German snipers and mortar fire. Can you imagine trying to survive in this small pocket of resistance, being consistently shelled? Houses are in ruins, there's no leaves on the trees, you've got no water stream, you've got no food, nowhere you can walk that's safe.
Day 4 did bring some good news. The 82nd Airborne finally captured Nijmegen Bridge after rowing across the river in canvas boats. But 2nd Battalion would not be relieved. 30 Corps was still bogged down clearing Nijmegen itself and didn't have the forces to advance on Arnhem. On the morning of day 5, organised resistance at the Arnhem Road Bridge finally collapsed. The last message from 2nd Battalion, picked up by German forces, read, "Out of ammunition, God save the King." With the fall of Arnhem Road Bridge, the Germans were able to rush in reinforcements, and the advance of 30 Corps quickly ground to a halt. Meanwhile, what remained of 1st Airborne at Oosterbeek seemed to be on the verge of destruction. But just as the Germans prepared for a final attack, they were saved by both artillery from 30 Corps, which was now within range, and the arrival of the 1st Polish Independent Parachute Brigade. Their landing was not a smooth one, with many aircraft turning back or shot down by anti-aircraft fire. Still, the men that did arrive drew off German forces from Oosterbeek. They dug in at Driel and managed to make contact with 30 Corps on day 6. The Allies had now linked up their forces, but any chance of salvaging Market Garden was truly lost when German tanks cut Allied supply lines further south at Wechel. As 30 Corps worked to re-establish communications, some Polish and British troops managed to cross the river and bolster the 1st Airborne defences, but the perimeter was simply being pounded into submission by German artillery, rockets and mortars. With wounded now piling up inside the cauldron, on day 8 the decision was finally made to evacuate. The withdrawal was remarkably similar to the British evacuation of Gallipoli during the First World War. At 9 p.m. on the 9th day, the first men silently slipped across the river in small boats. The evacuations would continue under the cover of an artillery barrage until dawn on day 10. When the Germans attacked that morning, they found full hospitals and empty trenches. Only around 2,000 men made it back across the river. Another 8,000 Polish and British were either killed or taken prisoner at Arnhem. And with that, Operation Market Garden was over.
Operation Market Garden is probably one of the most popular topics discussed with our visitors. We have only just shown you a glimpse of what we hold in our collection. Come and visit us at Airborne Assault, the official museum of the Parachute Regiment and the British Airborne Forces.